Welcome to the Health Seed Podcast, everybody. Logan here along with Luna.
Hey, everyone.
Today on the Deep Dive, we're tackling a subject that, well, it sparks a lot of debate. GMO food technology.
It really does. It's everywhere, but not always well understood.
Exactly. So we've gathered a whole bunch of information, really looked into the science, the history, the controversies surrounding genetically modified organisms in our food.
Yeah, a comprehensive overview.
Our mission here is to kind of cut through that confusion, give you a solid understanding of what GMOs actually are, how they came about.
The arguments for and against them.
Right, and the trade-offs you might think about when you're choosing between GMO and non-GMO stuff at the store.
We've got a lot to unpack from our sources, so yeah, let's dive in.
Okay, let's kick things off with the basics. What exactly is a GMO? It sounds pretty high-tech, maybe even a bit sci-fi for some folks.
That's a fair starting point. So, at its core, a genetically modified organism, or GMO, is basically any organism, could be a plant, animal, even bacteria, where its genetic material, its DNA, has been deliberately changed using modern biotech tools.
DNA, like the instruction manual.
Exactly like that. Think of DNA as the super detailed instruction manual inside every living thing, telling it how to grow, function, everything. Genetic engineering, then, is like precisely editing a specific word or sentence in that manual.
Okay, editing the manual to get a certain result, I guess.
Precisely. You want to introduce a specific desirable trait.
So how does that work for, say, crops, the food we eat?
Right. For crops, it usually follows a few key steps. First, scientists pinpoint a specific trait they're after. Maybe it's resistance to insects, or maybe being able to handle drought better.
Okay.
Often the specific instruction for that trait is actually found in a totally different organism. A classic example is beet corn. You hear about that one a lot.
Yeah, beet corn. What's the story there?
Well, the BT comes from a soil bacterium, Bacillus thuringiensis. This bacterium naturally produces a protein that's toxic to certain insect larvae.
Ah, so they took the gene for that protein.
Exactly. They identified that specific gene in the bacterium. Then, using molecular biology tools, think really tiny, precise genetic scissors and paste, they isolate that gene.
And stick it into the corn's DNA.
That's the next big step, inserting it into the target plant's DNA. There are different ways to do this. Older methods involve things like gene guns, literally shooting tiny DNA-coated particles into plant cells.
This is a bit forceful.
A bit, yeah. But now, technologies like CRISPR-Cas9 have really changed the game. Think of CRISPR as incredibly precise molecular scissors combined with a very sophisticated find and replace function.
So much more targeted.
Much more. It lets scientists cut the plant's DNA at a very specific spot and insert the new gene way more accurately with less unintended disruption to the rest of the genetic code, like microsurgery on the DNA.
Okay, CRISPR sounds super important. So the gene's in, do you just plant it and get super corn?
Huh. Not quite that fast. The modified cells need to be grown into full plants, usually in a lab setting first. Then comes tons of testing.
Testing for what?
Well, first, to make sure the new trait is actually working, like, does the beet corn really produce the insect-killing protein? And crucially, testing for safety.
Safety for us and the environment.
Absolutely. Rigorous safety assessments to ensure it's safe for humans and animals to eat, and that it won't cause unexpected problems in the environment. Only after it clears all those hurdles, often reviewed by agencies like the FDA and EPA, do they scale up seed production for farmers.
Oh, wow. Okay, so it's a very involved process, heavily checked.
Definitely. It's not a casual undertaking.
You mentioned beet corn. What are some other common GMOs people might actually encounter, maybe without realizing it?
Another huge one is Roundup-ready soybeans. These are engineered to withstand the herbicide glyphosate, which is the active ingredient in Roundup.
So farmers can spray for weeds without killing the soy.
That's the idea. It simplifies weed management for them. Then there's golden rice. That one's interesting because it wasn't about farming efficiency, but nutrition.
Golden rice, I've heard of that. Vitamin A.
Exactly. It was modified to produce beta-carotene, which our bodies convert into vitamin A. The goal was to help fight vitamin A deficiency, a really serious health problem in parts of the developing world.
So those examples show different goals. Less pesticide, easier farming, better nutrition. Seems the intentions were pretty positive.
Yeah, the main drivers often are things like increasing yields to feed more people, reducing pesticide use, boosting nutrition, or making crops tough enough for difficult climates like drought or salty soil.
And all rigorously tested, you said?
Supposedly, yes. They face significant regulatory scrutiny before hitting the market.
Okay, that gives us a good handle on what they are. Let's maybe rewind a bit. How did this technology even start? What's the history?
Well, the groundwork was really laid back in the 1970s. Big breakthroughs in molecular biology. The key moment, arguably, was 1973.
What happened then?
Two scientists, Herbert Boyer and Stanley Cohen, developed what's called recombinant DNA technology. Basically, they figured out how to cut DNA from one source and paste it into another, creating new genetic combinations.
So mixing and matching genes between different organisms.
Precisely. That was the fundamental breakthrough that made genetic engineering possible. It opened up a whole new world of possibilities, especially for agriculture.
A scientific leap. But what pushed it towards becoming a big industry? Was there a legal or business angle?
Oh, absolutely. A huge moment came in 1980, the U.S. Supreme Court ruling in Diamond v. Chakrabarty.
What did that case decide?
It ruled that genetically modified organisms could be patented.
Ah, so you could own a modified life form, essentially.
In a way, yes. That decision was massive. It created a strong financial incentive for companies to pour money into GMO research and development. If you could patent it, you could profit from it.
Makes sense. That probably spurred a lot of investment.
It definitely did. And some argue it also paved the way for a few big companies to eventually dominate the sector.
Who were the early players, and what were they focused on initially?
You saw companies like Monsanto, DuPont, Syngenta getting heavily involved early on. Academic researchers were critical too, of course. The initial focus for crops was mainly on traits helpful to farmers.
Like the pest resistance and herbicide tolerance you mentioned.
Exactly. That technology for pest resistance, Roundup Ready for herbicide tolerance, things to make farming easier, reduce losses. Though, fun fact, the very first GMO plant wasn't even food.
Oh yeah, what was it?
It was an antibiotic-resistant tobacco plant made by Monsanto back in '82, kind of marked the shift from modifying microbes to modifying actual plants.
Tobacco.
That
Okay. When did the food we eat start getting modified?
the first GMO food approved for sale was the Flav Sav tomato in 1994.
Flav Savar. What did it do?
It was engineered by a company called Calgene to ripen more slowly. The idea was a longer shelf life, less spoilage.
Did it take off? I don't remember ever seeing one.
Yeah, it wasn't a huge commercial success, ultimately, but it was a landmark, the first time a genetically modified food actually reached the grocery store.
And then things really accelerated, right?
Yeah.
I feel like GMO corn and soy became big news in the late 90s.
You're absolutely right. The floodgates kind of opened around 1996. That's when GMO soybeans and corn, engineered for herbicide tolerance and pest resistance, were introduced widely in the U.S.
And farmers adopted them quickly.
incredibly quickly. By the year 2000, something like half of all the soybeans grown in the U.S. were GMO. It was a rapid transformation.
Wow. And it spread globally, too.
Yep, the 2000s saw GMO crops expand worldwide. Brazil, Argentina, India, China became major growers. Things like brute cotton became really important in some developing countries, alongside continued work on golden rice.
And then more recently, you mentioned CRISPR really shaking things up again in the 2010s.
Exactly. CRISPR technology made gene editing much more precise, faster, and maybe even cheaper. It allows scientists to make very specific changes, sometimes even without introducing genes from other species, which some see as less controversial. It's just accelerated everything.
So looking back at that history, short but pretty dramatic, what were the big underlying goals driving all this?
It really boils down to a few key things. Trying to tackle global food security, feeding a growing planet, aiming to reduce the environmental impact of farming less pesticides, maybe less water use, and developing crops that are more resilient, tougher against pests, diseases, and the effects of climate change.
A mix of scientific ambition, economic drivers, and, well, the need to grow food.
Pretty much. And you had key players all along scientists, companies like Monsanto and Syngenta, but also early critics like Greenpeace raising questions right from the start.
Which brings us neatly to the big C word, controversy. GMOs seem incredibly divisive.
Oh, absolutely. They're right up there among the most debated topics in food and agriculture. The arguments fly in all directions: health, environment, economics, ethics, you name it.
Okay, so let's try to unpack that. What's the general argument for GMOs from the perspective of scientists and industry?
Well, the broad scientific consensus, supported by major regulatory bodies worldwide, is that the GMOs currently on the market are safe to eat. They also point to benefits like increased crop yields, sometimes cited in the 20–30% range.
That's significant.
It can be. And reduced pesticide use in some cases, like with butte crops, maybe up to 35% less insecticide needed. So the argument is they can contribute to sustainability and food security.
Okay. And the other side.
Right.
What are the main points from critics or those who are skeptical?
The concerns are varied. Some worry about potential, maybe unknown, long-term health risks. Others focus on environmental damage like the rise of herbicide-resistant weeds or harm to pollinators. There's also a big concern about corporate control over seeds and the food supply. And for some, it's just a feeling that it's unnatural.
And how does the public generally feel? Is it different in different places?
Public perception is definitely mixed and varies geographically. You mentioned a Pew study from 2020 finding nearly half of U.S. adults distrust GMOs to some extent. In Europe, skepticism is generally much higher, leading to stricter regulations, even bans.
Yeah, you hear
Right.
about that.
And unfortunately, social media doesn't always help clarify things. Misinformation can spread pretty easily, making it hard for people to get a handle on the actual science.
You mentioned the scientific consensus on safety.
Mm.
Are there specific studies that get pointed to a lot on either side of the argument?
Yes, definitely. On the pro-GMO side, a really influential one is a big meta-analysis from 2013 by Nicolia and colleagues. They looked at over 1,700 studies spanning a decade.
Wow. What did they find?
Their conclusion was that based on that vast amount of data, there was no solid scientific evidence showing risks to health from the GMO crops studied. It's often cited to back up the consensus view of organizations like the WHO or national academies.
Okay. And on the flip side, are there studies critics often raise?
The one that comes up most often is probably the Seralini study from 2012.
Seralini. What did that one claim?
It claimed to find links between rats eating a type of GMO corn and the herbicide it was resistant to, and developing tumors and organ damage.
That sounds alarming.
It did, and it got a lot of media attention. However, it was heavily criticized by many scientists for its methods, things like the type of rat used, which is prone to tumors anyway, and the statistical analysis.
So the methods were questioned.
Widely questioned, yes. The journal that published it eventually retracted the paper, although Seralini later got it republished elsewhere. But despite the retraction and criticism, it definitely fueled a lot of the anti-GMO sentiment.
It seems like interpreting the science is a real battleground here. Let's dig into some of those specific debate points. Health safety seems like the biggest one for many people.
It often is. And the pro-GMO stance, as we said, relies heavily on that large body of evidence, thousands of studies, regulatory reviews. Bodies like the National Academy of Sciences, WHO, FDA, they all essentially say the GMOs on the market are as safe as their non-GMO equivalents.
No difference in nutrition or allergens.
Generally, no significant difference is found. The testing they undergo is extensive animal feeding studies, checking the composition down to the molecular level. They specifically look for new allergens or toxins. Take potato proteins in corn, for instance.
Yeah.
They're very specific to certain insects, and humans just digest them like any other protein, harmless to us.
But the critics still have health concerns. What are they pointing to beyond Seralini?
Well, they sometimes argue that we don't have enough really long-term human studies, like tracking people for decades, which is admittedly very difficult to do for any specific food. There are also worries about potential unforeseen effects, maybe subtle changes to gut bacteria, though the science on that is still evolving for all foods.
So a call for more research, more caution.
Often, yes. Groups like the Non-GMO Project basically advocate for a precautionary principle, let's be absolutely sure, before we widely adopt something.
Okay, let's shift to the environment. What's a pro-GMO argument there? How can they be good for the environment?
The potential benefits highlighted are things like reduced insecticide use with Braddock crops. That 2014 study by Klemper and Quaim suggested an average global reduction of over 8%. Also, if GMOs lead to higher yields on the same land.
You don't need to clear as much new land for farming.
Exactly. It could potentially spare forests or other habitats. And then there's the potential for drought-tolerant crops needing less water. Some data suggests savings of over 17% in certain cases.
But we also hear about negative environmental impacts. What are the big concerns?
A major one is the link between herbicide-tolerant crops like Roundup-ready ones and the increased use of glyphosate.
Because farmers can spray it more freely.
Right. And over time, this has led to the evolution of glyphosate-resistant weeds, superweeds, which then require even more or different herbicides to control. That's a definite problem.
Are there other environmental worries?
Yes, concerns about harm to non-target species, like pollinators. The potential impact of glyphosate on monarch butterfly populations, for example, has been studied. And there's the risk of gene flow,
Gene flow.
where the modified genes spread from the GMO crop to wild relatives, like GMO canola genes getting into wild mustard in Canada.
Yeah.
That could create herbicide-resistant weeds or affect biodiversity.
Okay, so environmental impacts are complex, potential upsides and downsides. What about labeling? That seems like a constant battle. Should GMOs be labeled?
Well, the argument against mandatory labeling, often from the FDA and industry, is that if a GMO food isn't significantly different in nutrition or safety, a special label isn't necessary and might wrongly imply a risk.
Because most corn and soy is GMO anyway and consumed widely.
That's part of the argument, yeah. They'd say mandatory labeling for GMOs, but not for other breeding techniques, could be misleading.
But lots of people want labels. Why the strong push for them?
It really comes down to transparency and consumer choice. Polls consistently show a majority, like that 64% Pew figure, want labels. They feel they have a right to know what's in their food, how it's made, so they can choose based on their own values or concerns.
Like in Europe, where labeling is stricter?
Exactly. Proponents point to Europe and say it empowers consumers. And the growth of the non-GMO project verification shows there's clearly a market demand for that information and for non-GMO options.
Okay, one more big controversy area, corporate control. The idea that a few big companies dominate seeds.
Yeah, that's a major concern for critics. On the other side, proponents argue that patents are necessary to fund the huge R&D costs.
To incentivize innovation.
Right, they'd say patents lead to beneficial traits like pest resistance, which can save farmers money, maybe $100 per hectare for bright crops, some studies suggest. And they might point to things like golden rice as examples of GMOs developed for humanitarian reasons, not just profit.
But the concentration of power is undeniable, isn't it?
It's significant. Critics point out that just a few companies, especially after mergers like Bayer buying Monsanto, control a huge chunk, maybe 90% of the GMO seed market.
And that raises concerns
About farmer dependency. Contracts often forbid farmers from saving seeds, meaning they have to buy new seeds every year. This can increase costs and reduce farmer autonomy. There are also debates, like the one around Brut cotton in India, about high seed prices potentially contributing to farmer debt, though that's a very complex issue with many factors.
So it's clear there are strong arguments, real trade-offs on all sides. Let's try to maybe summarize. What are the key wins or advantages GMOs seem to offer?
Okay, summarizing the potential pluses. Higher yields, potentially, which helps with food security. Reduced pesticide use in some cases, like Brett crops cutting insecticide needs. Enhanced nutrition possibilities, like golden rice. Climate resilience, developing crops that handle drought or salt better. And economic benefits for farmers, lower costs, less labor sometimes.
Got it. And the flip side, the main downsides or concerns often raised.
Concerns center on potential health risks, though again, the scientific consensus doesn't currently support this for approved GMOs. Environmental impacts increase glyphosate use, resistant weeds, potential harm to pollinators, gene flow, corporate control dominance by a few companies, farmer dependency, seed costs, and the issue of public trust and labeling debates.
Okay, now let's flip it. What about choosing non-GMO? What are the perceived advantages there?
Big one is consumer demand and trust. People want non-GMO options, as the market shows. Choosing non-GMO aligns with values for many natural, organic, anti-corporate sentiment. Environmentally, it avoids GMO-specific risks like gene flow, and organic non-GMO practices can boost biodiversity. And, well, labeling provides transparency.
And the drawbacks or challenges of relying solely on non-GMO?
Generally, lower yields compared to some GMOs, meaning potentially more land needed. Sometimes higher production costs due to potentially more pesticides or labor needed for non-GMO conventional farming. Non-GMO crops can be more vulnerable to pests, diseases, and climate stress. And developing new traits through traditional breeding is much slower than genetic engineering.
It really is a balancing act, isn't it? No easy answers.
Not at all. It's not black and white. You really have to look at the specific GMO trait, the context, weigh the pros and cons. Supporting diverse farming systems, including well-managed GMOs, and non-GMO approaches like organic, seems like a sensible path.
Okay, so for listeners trying to make sense of this in the grocery aisle, what's some practical advice?
First, try to educate yourself beyond the headlines. Look into specific GMO traits, not just the label GMO. Be super wary of misinformation, especially online. Cross-check claims with reliable sources, FDA, WHO, National Academy of Sciences.
Check the sources. Good advice for anything, really.
Absolutely. When shopping, look for labels if avoiding GMOs is important to you. Non-GMO project verified or USDA organic. Know that the US bioengineered label exists but might not cover everything.
Yeah.
Think about your budget versus your values. GMO ingredients often make food cheaper. Maybe you prioritize non-GMO for certain items but not others. If transparency matters, support brands that are open about sourcing, maybe advocate for clearer labeling.
Stay open-minded too.
Yeah, keep an eye on new developments like CRISPR, which might be different, and maybe the simplest advice, eat a varied diet, including GMO, non-GMO, organic. Variety is generally good anyway.
That sounds like solid, balanced advice. And if people want to do that deeper dive themselves, where should they look online?
3 good starting points. The National Academy of Sciences website, nances.edu, great for in-depth peer-reviewed reports, often with good summaries.
So,
The FDA's section on agricultural biotechnology on fda.gov.
right.
They have consumer guides, regulatory info, myth-busting.
Yeah.
And the Alliance for Science website, allianceforscience.org. It's based at Cornell University, offers evidence-based articles, global news, and actively tries to counter misinformation.
Excellent resources. Plenty for people to chew on there. Speaking of things to chew on, did you hear about the genetically modified mosquito? They engineered it to only bite politicians.
Huh. Now, that's a targeted application of biotechnology I could potentially get behind. Haven't seen that one in the journals yet, though.
Just wishful thinking, perhaps.
Perhaps. Well, I hope this session cleared up some points regarding GMO versus non-GMO foods. That's all the time we have today. Take care, everyone.
Yeah, definitely a lot to think about. Maybe consider what surprised you most today about the science or the debate, and perhaps check out one of those resources, like what the National Academy of Sciences says. Until next time, on The Deep Dive.